And the recording is on, and we are beginning, continuing our journey through the second chapter, through the second parak of Makkos. Now, the Gemara we are going to pick up this evening can be found on Ches Amud Beis. That's on 8b if you are in the art scroll, and probably still 8b to the first power in case you're following along in art scroll. And again, if it's in Sefaria, just type in Sefaria Makkos 8b and it will come up. So what we're picking up on today is actually a continuation from last week's discussion. And the important thing that we want to remember from last week's discussion was that we learned an important Shas concept, an important principle in the Talmud called a Hechsher mitzvah. A Hechsher mitzvah is something that enables a mitzvah. It doesn't bear intrinsic significance. God did not command me to do it, but it enables me to fulfill a commandment that God commanded. So a Hechsher mitzvah that we talked about last time is chopping wood to build a sukkah, to dwell in a sukkah. There's no mitzvah to chop wood for the purpose of building a sukkah, but it's a Hechsher mitzvah. It's a means to fulfilling the mitzvah. So it has a certain degree of significance in halacha, but not quite enough to qualify for the exemption that if you are osek b'dvar mitzvah, involved in a mitzvah action, then you are exempt from going into galus, into exile, should you inadvertently kill someone in the process. So just to whet our appetites a little bit, remember last time we talked about if a doctor who accidentally kills the patient during the surgery goes to galus? So a similar question, but even more intricate that I want to talk about at the end of today, God willing, is if God forbid, I have to preface all these cases with God forbid. So if I ever missed that, you know what I mean, that we're all talking about death and dying. It's all bad. If an ambulance is on, I always wonder this, by the way, an ambulance is on his way to save somebody or rushing someone to the hospital, but in the meantime, it's over the speed limit because it's trying to save someone's life. And as you can imagine, I'm sure this has to have happened at some point. It ran over somebody in the process. Toby, you're the personal injury attorney. Has that ever come by your desk? Is that it has. Okay. So emergency service vehicle on its way to stop somebody from dying. Ironically, it kills somebody in the process. So what we're going to talk about hopefully at the end of today is the ambulance driver go to gullus in that kind of situation? And in what way may he be different than a typical doctor? So just to whet our appetites, hopefully we'll get there. So a Hechsher mitzvah, good. So we are 4 lines from the top of Ches Amud Beis, 4 lines from the top of 8b. And the Gemara is basically Ika Damasnila. What it's doing is it says there's a different version. The Gemara will do this many times. They'll say there was a similar conversation that took place, but we have a different record of how the Hechsher mitzvah discussion went down. But in principle, we're going to be seeing the same ideas play out again. So if we were here last week, these are all familiar concepts. And if we weren't here last week or we forgot, then we're going to rehash it right now. Ika Damasila aha becharish ubakatzer tishbos. So there is another version of this discussion. If we could just mute ourselves, please. There is another version of this discussion about Hechsher mitzvah. So we taught as follows. This comes up in apparently in Shvius, which makes sense as you'll see. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Einot Tzarich Lomar Char Shel Shvius Ukatzer Shel Shvius. It says in the verse that plowing and reaping you shall Shabbos. You shall. I'm just going to mute where it's coming from. There we go. You shall rest from plowing and from reaping. But the question is, if it's talking about Shabbos, I already know that I'm not supposed to do Malachos on Shabbos. What's this extra verse coming to tell me? So there's 2 interpretations. Number one, this is going to be not really germane to our discussion, but we quote the entire interpretation. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Eino tzarich lomer char shel shvius ukatzer shel shvius, right? Kvar nemar. So decha lo sizor v'charmcha lo sizmor. Already told me in the Torah that I shouldn't be planting and reaping on Shabbos. Ela afilu char shel erev shvius shenichnas l'shvius What's this extra verse coming to tell me? According to the first interpretation, which is of Rabbi Akiva, it's to teach me that if I plowed so that something grows into Shvias, or if I reaped something that grew over the course of Shvias, meaning the 7th sabbatical year when I'm not supposed to be working the earth, even if I planted before, and even if I'm reaping afterwards, it's considered to have Shemitah, Shviya status, and that means it can't be sold, and there are certain Shemitah restrictions on there. That's Rabbi Akiva's idea. Keep that in your mind, but you don't need to hold it in your mind for the next part of the Gemara, but good for general knowledge. Rabbi Shmuel has a different interpretation of this superfluous verse. Makkos av kotzer rishus yotza katsir ha'omer shu mitzvah. So Rabbi Shmuel tells us there's no such thing in the Torah as a mitzvah to plow. Never in the Torah is there any mitzvah to plow. So therefore, the kind of plowing the verse must be referring to is you're plowing for your farm. You're plowing for a non-mitzvah objective. When I talk about, someone pointed this out to me last week that was a little ambiguous. I want to clarify. When I say voluntary versus obligatory deeds that we are performing, I mean in terms of halacha, and meaning if it's halakhically obligatory or if it's voluntary, meaning obviously we all have to, a farmer needs to plow in order to eat, but that's still considered voluntary from a halakhic standpoint. So just as the digging that is being prohibited, the plowing that's prohibited in this verse is of a voluntary nature, so too we must assume that the reaping also is of a voluntary nature. It's one theme. Therefore, the verse is saying on Shabbos, you shall not plow, you shall not reap. Yatzak sir ha'omer shu mitzvah, to the exclusion of, right? We're counting the omer. Anyone ever wonder what the omer is actually? Well, there's this barley offering that we bring on the second day of Pesach. So at night, we go ahead and we start bringing this offering. So this offering of the omer, there is not just, if you happen to have barley that's already reaped, you can use it. There's an intrinsic mitzvah to reap the barley itself, even if you already have barley that is available. Therefore, if it turns out that the Pesach ends, the first day of Pesach ends, and the second day of Pesach is Shabbos, you would have to actually cut the omer on Shabbos, and it supersedes Shabbos because the verse is telling us only non-obligatory reaping and plowing can be done on Shabbos, but obligatory reaping, which is for the omer, that supersedes Shabbos. That's what Rabbi Shmuel says. So that we really need to keep in mind. That's going to be essential. So that's the quote. That's their machlokes of Tanoim. Now we're on the Amoraic level. We're going to question this teaching. Amar le'ahumer abanan l'Rava. So someone from among the rabbis, he asked the great sage Rava, "Mimai decharisha derashus, dilma charisha sa'omer de mitzvah, v'afilu hachi amar rachmana tishbos." Well, how do we know that the verse is talking about voluntary acts of reaping and planting? Maybe the planting that's alluded to, the plowing that's alluded to in the pasuk is a mitzvah of plowing. Well, I already actually spoiled it. I gave us the answer. Amar le, answer number one, kevan de matzah charash eno choresh lav mitzvah, because there's no intrinsic mitzvah to plow a field to have the omer offering. If I found for instance, if I have a field that's already plowed and already planted and is growing the barley that I need, there's no mitzvah to go ahead and plow another field and say, Hineni muchan mezuma l'shem mitzvahs charisha. So you don't need to do that. So there's no intrinsic mitzvah of charisha, of plowing. So we assume that since the plowing in the pasuk is voluntary, the reaping in the pasuk is voluntary. Thus, obligatory reaping supersedes Shabbos. There's no prohibition. However, isfei Rabina l'Rava. Rabina asked from our Mishnah, Yotza ha'av ha'makis beno. This is going to sound familiar now. This is a different version of our conversation from last time. Yotza ha'av ha'makis beno, v'arav ha'rodes talmido, u'shliach beistin. Remember in our Mishnah last week, we learned that a father, teacher, or I still don't have a good translation for shliach beistin, but basically an agent of the court who is meting out the lashes, should they kill the recipient in the process, they would not be chayiv mis. They would not go to galus. They don't go to exile because they are performing a mitzvah. Ay v'amai lema came into ilu gamer lav mitzvah hashanami lav mitzvah. Wait a minute, but if the child already learned his lesson, there's no mitzvah to discipline him more, right? Wrong. Hasam avagav de gamer nami mitzvah ka'avid dichsiv yaser bincha v'nichecha. There's always a mitzvah to discipline the children. There's always a discipline to give. There's always a reason to give them another lesson. I don't know if that's what all the professionals say in their education classes and how to raise a child these days, but apparently that was the assumption of Chazal. And I still owe everybody a Monday night shir where we're going to talk about how contemporary posts can deal with it. It's just that this coming Monday night, I want to give a shir that's related to Yom HaZikaron, so you'll forgive me if we're postponing that a little bit. Okay, so answer number one is that there's no intrinsic mitzvah of plowing. Great. And we said also, now why in the Mishnah is it considered to be a mitzvah always to discipline a child? Because he can always use more discipline. Okay. Next version that Rava is going to answer, and it's very similar to what we just said. Hadar Amar Rava, La Milzahida Amri. I got a better answer. Kitsira Dumi Decharisha. So again, the reaping in the verse needs to be of the same nature as the plowing that's referred to in the verse. Macharisha Matza Chorish Eno Choresh Af Kitsira Nami. So again, okay, so the Mefarshim point this out that what we're talking about here is plowing may actually be a mitzvah. There may be an intrinsic value in plowing to plant for the carbon omer. However, if you happen to already have the omer planted, it's all done, then you don't need to go ahead and plant. But if you don't have the ability, if you don't have the means for the omer, for the barley, then you actually have a bona fide mitzvah to go ahead and plant it yourself. This is akin for my Thursday morning Rav Lichtenstein folks. We were talking about this, how something could be intrinsically a mitzvah, but sometimes circumstances will make that mitzvah applicable. Sometimes it won't. Toby, right? You pointed out about conversion, I remember. And the other example that the poskim always discuss is tzitzis. So there's no obligation for me as a man to find a garment that has tzitzis on it and dafka wear it. But once I'm already wearing a four-cornered garment, it's incumbent upon me to wear the tzitzis. It's a mitzvah. So just because something's a mitzvah doesn't mean it always applies. And that's what we're saying here as well, that the plowing is a mitzvah, but it's only a mitzvah if I don't have the means for the carbon omer. And so therefore we assume also that the katsira that we're talking about here is something that is not going to be a mitzvah in all circumstances. Therefore, Rabbi Shmuel can tell us that if we're talking about a katsira, a reaping that is obligatory in all circumstances, that's not what the pasuk is addressing. That's not what the verse is telling me I cannot do on Shabbos. And therefore, we learn that if we're talking about a reaping that's always obligatory under all circumstances, such as reaping specifically for the sake of the carbon omer, then it supersedes Shabbos. Mitzvah. Matzah katzor eno kotzer. If you're going to say that I could suffice with just whatever barley was already reaped, mitzvah lixer lahavin. That's not true. There's always a mitzvah to reap specifically for the sake of the omer. And that brings us to the Mishnah, and that concludes our discussion about hechsher mitzvah. Though I want to actually just, I guess, one little editorial over here. I remember. You'll tell me how good this mashal is. I remember when I was working as an intern for a Jewish nonprofit organization, I asked them one time, So how do you make sure to incorporate Torah into your, you guys are fundraising, you're doing all sorts of important things, but not intrinsically religious. How do you inject religiosity into what you do? So they said, we start off all of our meetings with some sort of Judaism. So I said, what do you mean? So they said, well, we always start with a text. I said, great, like Pirkei Avos, Makkos, what are you starting with? They said, it could be like a newspaper clipping. But since Judaism values text-based discussion, we'll start with an article from the New York Times, and that's how we're Mekayim it. And so what they mixed up actually was the mitzvah with the Hechsher mitzvah. The mitzvah is Talmud Torah. The mitzvah is learning Torah. It happens to be that our Torah is written here in this Gemara, in this book. But the pages and the words are a means to getting to the concepts, to the knowledge. And so sometimes we mix up the means to a mitzvah with the actual mitzvah itself. So it's always important to keep the priorities in check. Ad kan, my little Dvar Torah over there. Okay, let me just pause. Any questions on this Gemara over here? I know we brought in our good friend Shemitah and Shvius again. We talked about it toward the beginning of our journeys through Makkos, but is there anything I can clarify? Or any ha'aros, any insights? Toby, you're muted, but it looks like you got something to say.
No, I'm just confused like I always am. No, just to conclusion with the Omer. So it is mandatory to reap new barley?
Right. So Matzeh Pesach, right, in Israel, where there's only one day. So right afterwards, they go ahead, they reap the Omer, and I think they have to mash it up and do some processes to it. And after it's processed, then it's ready to be brought. So that's done Motzei Pesach, the first day of Pesach.
So despite the give and take on this in these last paragraphs, that's the rule.
Yeah, so that remains a constant. That's an important takeaway. And now right? You always wonder. I always wonder around this. Like, that's such a random time. The second night of Pesach, we start counting Sphira. Mm-hmm. Well, the counting starts because of the Omer offering. So now we know why it starts then. So important takeaway.
Well, let me ask you something, Rabbi. I mean, it started the second night because they only had one night of Yom Tov.
Exactly.
So if you're living in Gullus, shouldn't it start on the next night?
No, the mitzvah Sphira starts because we know really the first day is the first day. So we're machmir. You're gonna go down the whole Yom Tov Sheni thing again.
Yeah, I mean, but because we would not go out and do it on the holiday, right? We would wait. They didn't do it on the first night because why?
So the thing is, mitzvah Sphira. I mean, probably today it's D'Rabbanan, but especially when it's D'Oraisa, we can't just push off that mitzvah because of Yom Tov Sheni. I mean, we keep Yom Tov Sheni l'chumra, but we can't, squander a mitzvah for the sake of the Yom Tov Sheni.
Got it.
I think that's why.
Okay,
but that's always I feel like that's every rabbi's bane is the recurring question of Yom Tov Sheni. I remember, every community I've ever been to, they say, when I was a rabbinical student, they say, you're in Smicha, so new, are you getting rid of Yom Tov Sheni? That's like what everyone always asks. It's like the number one question.
Isn't it that you have to count back 50 days from whenever Shavuos falls out? That's when you would start counting the Omer?
I mean, I guess it's kind of like a backwards way of saying the same thing, no?
Yeah.
Okay, same numbers work out.
Yeah, but Toby asked why the second night, why not the first?
I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay, that's a good point. Good hara. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. So this okay. Ha'av gola aide haben v'aben gola aide. We're going to talk about different permutations of who can send whom into Gullus by being killed by them. What do I mean by that? Take a look in the Mishnah. Ha'av gola aide haben v'aben gola aide ha'av. A father who inadvertently kills his son, he gets sent into Gullus. V'aben gola aide ha'av. And a son who inadvertently kills his father also goes into exile. What's the question you're all going to ask me? What's the contradiction between this Mishnah and the previous one?
Hold on.
Remember in the previous Mishnah, we said if a father inadvertently kills his son, he does not go into exile because there's always a mitzvah to discipline him more. So there's an apparent contradiction over here, because here it's saying he does go into exile if he inadvertently kills his son. So what are we talking about over here? It looks like a complete contradiction between this mission and the previous one. Not to worry if that's bothering you, because it's bothering the Gemara as well, and we will get an answer. Trust me. Next part of the Mishnah. Hakol Golin Ide Yisrael. Anyone who kills a regular, this isn't like a Yisrael as opposed to a Kohen, it just means a Jewish person. Someone kills a Jewish person, goes to Gullus. Yisrael Golin Idehen, and Yisrael who kills them goes into Gullus. Who is them? This ambiguous them that we're referring to. Also, the Gemara will address who that is. But chutz mi ger toshav, with the exclusion of a ger toshav. A ger toshav is a resident in the land of Israel who adheres to the Sheva Mitzvah Noach, the 7 Noahide laws. So, on the one hand, on the totem pole, they're a little higher up than your average non-Jew, but they, of course, are not considered on as high as Jews in that legal totem pole that we'll be discussing. So we will discuss that. So chutz mi ger toshav, v'ger toshav ino gola ela aide ger toshav. The only instance that a ger toshav would go into exile for killing someone would be if he kills another ger toshav. But should he kill a regular Jewish person, he, instead of going to Gullus, I believe he actually gets capital punishment. So we will discuss that as well. Okay, any immediate questions on the Mishnah before we proceed to the Gemara? Okay.
You're saying there's a double standard of guilt depending on whether you're pure blood Israeli or a ger toshav?
Whether your pure blood is, what do you mean by that? You mean Jewish?
Right. I mean, if a Jewish person kills, if a Jewish person kills another Jewish person by accident, he goes to exile. But you're saying that if a resident alien kills a Jewish person by accident, he's killed?
I believe that is the din. So just to help frame
how can that be? How does that work in Israeli society today? I mean,
I don't know how Israeli society does it per se. Israel's not following halacha right now, but
how can that be? It's immoral.
So the understanding, I mean, again, you know, if it's Torah, it's a Torah. So I don't have what to comment on the morality aspect. But the idea is that anyone who inadvertently kills another person really should be put to death. You know, the same way if I inadvertently damage your property, it doesn't matter if I inadvertently did it, I'm responsible. So in theory, if I inadvertently kill someone, really I should receive capital punishment. That's the baseline assumption. It's only a special leniency that we give to a Jew who kills a fellow Jew that he goes into exile. But other people do not qualify for this because you have to have higher membership status to get that kind of special treatment. Does that mean that there is a hierarchy? Yeah, there is. Does it mean you have to be happy with it? Not necessarily, but a lot of halacha, whether we like it or not, actually is predicated on certain forms of statuses and hierarchies and benefits to certain membership statuses. So the Yisraelim, they have like the diamond status, and the ger toshav has the I don't know what the lower statuses are, but you can fill in some mushal over there.
I see no morality problem because Hashem establishes morality, not man. And if Hashem establishes a hierarchy, that is the morality.
That is fair. Okay.
Don't argue with it.
You know what? That'll be actually, Toby, one of our Rav Lichtenstein essays in the other book that if we get to it, talks about if there is an ethic independent of halacha. So I think you will enjoy that. But Zayda, your point is well taken as well, that God's morality trumps our preconceived notions. So, okay, for another share. Okay, moving forward into the Gemara. Ha'av gola ayite haben. A father goes into Gullus by inadvertently killing his son. Didn't we learn in the previous Mishnah that a father who inadvertently kills his son, he doesn't go into Gullus? So maybe the Gemara answers the Gomer, where his son already learned his lesson, or already learned the Torah he needs to learn. There's no mitzvah to discipline him. That's not a good answer. Why? Because we already dealt with this. Even though he's already learned his lesson, there's always a mitzvah to discipline him more. So maybe Bashuli Denagri, where he's teaching him to become a carpenter. So he's teaching him a profession. So that's not a mitzvah. So the father is no longer performing a mitzvah because teaching his son to become a carpenter, there's no mitzvah there. Now, some of you are going to say, wait a minute, I learned the Gemara Maseches Kiddushin. There is a mitzvah to teach my son a livelihood, right, Toby? Okay, I see you nodding there. He's teaching him a livelihood. So what do you mean that's not a mitzvah? It's not Talmud Torah, but it's certainly a mitzvah to teach one's son a trade. So the answer is the Gomer Nusa Achrisi. He's teaching him an elective, meaning his son already went to trade school. His son already knows how to be a carpenter. He already knows how to be a lawyer. He already knows whatever his profession is. But now his father is teaching him electives, right? They're practicing knife throwing or archery just for the fun of it. In that kind of case, the father inadvertently kills his son. He would go to Gullus. Why? Because there's no mitzvah to be doing this. So if they're involved in a hobby together, there's no intrinsic mitzvah. Now, is it a good idea for a parent to spend time with their child? Yes, of course it is. But there's no legal obligation binding them to that. And that's the key point.
I would be very wary of Jewish carpenters.
Yeah? Okay, so duly noted. Any questions on that section right there? Okay, so that resolves our question. Great. Moving forward. Vaben gola av. Now, we also said the reverse, that a son, a child who inadvertently, God forbid, kills their parent, they also get sent into galus. Now, there's something a little bit odd about that. Now, what usually is just to give a little background, a child, forget about killing their parent, even a child who strikes his parent is liable to the death penalty. So just to put things in perspective over here. So Raminhi, we have a contradiction. It says, Make nefesh prat lemake aviv. It says in the pasuk that he will strike him a fatal blow to the exclusion, or rather, Make nefesh, you have to translate here as nefesh, meaning a random person, a random soul, a random individual, to the exclusion of someone who's Make aviv, someone who strikes his father. So it sounds like from here that a child who strikes his father is actually let off the hook. He doesn't go into exile. Why is that? So we're gonna venture two answers. Why would a child be let off the hook if he inadvertently kills his father? Amar Rav Kahana, lo kasha, ha Rabbi Shimon v'ha Rabbanan. It's a machlokas Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon damar chenek chamor misayif, shigasayif nisla kapara, shigas chenek lo nisla kapara. So you have to keep in mind two things. When if I straight up murder another individual, I get capital punishment. That's sayif. That's death by the sword. But there is an additional prohibition that a son is violating when he kills his father, which incurs misas chenek, death by strangulation. So the thing is, we could only kill him one way. We could only either decapitate him or strangulate him. So the question is, which one is considered the more severe punishment that he would receive? So according to Rabbi Shimon says that strangulation is more severe than decapitation. Therefore, the child is. Let me just pause it's not pause, mute where the noise is coming from. Phyllis, can you mute, please? It's not muting on my side. Thank you. Okay, so the Rabbi Shimon says that since strangulation is more severe than the sword, the son is really going to receive strangulation in a case where he deliberately killed his father. But since over here he didn't deliberately kill his father, so the question is, should he go to Gullus? Should he be exiled? The thing is, only when, so we only know a case from the Torah. The paradigm of the Torah is when I kill someone inadvertently, and really I should be receiving decapitation. really I should be killed by the sword, but I get to go to Gullus because I'm told that if I go into exile, I can receive an atonement instead of being killed. However, since this child is really supposed to get strangulation in a case where he deliberately kills his father, we have no source to tell us that for someone who really should be getting strangulation when they deliberately kill someone, when they inadvertently kill someone, the way to atone for that is going to exile. We don't have any precedent for that. And therefore, according to Rabbi Shimon, this teaching tells us that a child doesn't get capital punishment because he didn't deliberately kill his father, but he doesn't go to Gullus either because that won't serve as an atonement for something that's supposed to receive strangulation. That only works if someone's supposed to receive decapitation. And now we just happen to throw in the other shita of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan de Amri Saif Chamor Michenek, that death by the sword is more severe than strangulation. According to Rabbanan, a child actually would go into exile. And that, of course, since it's the opinion of the Rabbanan, that is likely how we paskin. It's likely what we hold. So don't worry, the child does not get off the hook in this regard. That's answer number one to explain, according to Rabbi Shimon, why a child would get off the hook. Rava gives a different answer. Answer number two. Rava Amar Prat le'oseh chabura ba'avid b'shogeg. Now, when we usually talk about a chabura, right, we're learning together right now. We are a chabura. We're a group coming together, or those who are who come to the daily Mishnayos Pesachim. So you're familiar with a chabura for a Karm Pesach. Here, a chabura doesn't mean a group. A chabura means to harm somebody. It's when you damage somebody. So someone who causes a child who causes a chabura to his father b'shogeg, salka daita chamina came into b'mezid bar katalahu b'shogeg nami ligli. I would have thought, okay, let's I should really draw a chart for this. That'd be easier. If a son kills his father deliberately, then he gets capital punishment. If he kills him inadvertently, he actually does go to Gullus. What was this exclusion talking about? Not where he inadvertently kills his father, but where he inadvertently just hits and harms his father. So in that case, if he deliberately harms his father, also capital punishment. But what if he only inadvertently harms his father? So he has two mitigating factors. One, it was inadvertent. Number two, he didn't actually kill him. He only damaged him. He only harmed him. So I would have thought the same way if he inadvertently kills his father, he gets exiled. So too, if he inadvertently harms his father. Kamash Malan comes along this teaching to tell us that in a case where he has two mitigating factors, A, it was inadvertent. B, he didn't kill him, he only harmed him, then he does not go into exile. And when you think about it, there's like real practical applications to this halakha. Here's a good question. Can a father and son go paintballing where they are on opposite teams? Well, when one goes paintballing, it's been quite a few years since I've done it. I think for the young adult community, we tried figuring it out, but it didn't work out exactly, but maybe we'll revisit that. So when you go paintballing, if you don't wear proper protective gear, which when I was a teenager, I'm like, oh, I'll put on this like sweatshirt over here, it'll protect me. You could get a bruise. So is it mutter for a son to play against his father? And also there's questions about what about a student against his Rebbe, if that's appropriate. So then you get into a whole interesting question of, can I be mochel? So I can't give you permission to kill me. It's not my soul to give up, right? The soul belongs to God. It's loaned to me. I cannot give you permission to kill me. That's not within my purview. But am I allowed to give you permission to harm me? Which would be great. So then if we go paintballing, I am implicitly mochel. I implicitly waive any form of harm that you bring to me. That's machlokus. That's unclear. But there's real practical applications that come out from this particular machlokus over here. Okay, let me pause. Any other questions? Any thoughts on this Gemara? Ruth, it looks like you want to say something there.
I'm disturbed by this because what is the reason there was a confrontation between the father and the son?
Mhm.
In other words, it's unclear. Now, you're supposed to teach your child, you know, there's a lot of parents that are abusive to the
Mhm.
child, or maybe it's self-defense. So you can't, it's not a black and white. In other words, it you know, we hope Jewish parents are reasonable and don't do physically abuse. But you know, there's all people in the world, and there are a lot of cases, you know. And to me, it doesn't answer what is the reason why there was confrontation, and did the child maybe was letting him protect himself because he's going to be. I don't know. It's not very clear to me. I'm not a lawyer, but it doesn't ring. What is the
Right.
reason for it?
So Ruth, I know your expertise is in history, and you're thinking about the narrative behind this. You're thinking about what's the story, who are the characters that play over here, what are their motivations, and you're definitely correct. If there was a self-defense motive here, a reasonable self-defense motive, that would be an additional factor in the equation. And if someone defends himself out of bona fide self-defense, then that's not considered murder. But we'll leave that for another discussion, but your point is well taken. So you got Yasher Koach.
Well, what was discussed, didn't that bring this into how to put it, brought this forth to just consider it. It seems very black and white to me.
Right.
You understand?
Well, what we need to do is we need to understand the baseline and the fundamental principles before we add in future complicating factors. So, Ruth, you're already 2 steps ahead of us. You're adding in all these different factors into the equation, and you are correct. Most times it's not clearly black and white, but we need to know what the core abstract principles are. And that's a lot of what we're doing over here. I know it's difficult. Sometimes they're, like you imagine, they're like, what kind of emotions led someone to such a terrible circumstance? And the challenge is thinking of this as an abstraction rather than what might be leading to it. So, Yasher Koach, let's go forward. Arthur, yeah.
There's an inherent problem with the son killing the father, because the son, once he does that, becomes a goel hadam, and he has an obligation, not a halacha obligation, an obligation to go after the one who killed the father. But that's him, right? So how can you let him, for example, go into the Ir Miklot, right? Normally they would keep the goel hadam out. Right? Now you're saying, well, you got to take him in because he's also the murderer.
That's a real fascinating point. You're saying that the son becomes his own goel hadam.
Yeah, I mean, so it's an inherently conflicted position. So they solve it by saying, never mind, we're not going to deal with this.
Wow, I didn't even think about that. All right, that's a great. Let me. You'll remind me hopefully if you could even send me an email. I'd love to look into that because that's just a fascinating legal category to be the person the goel hadam is supposed to kill, but also being the goel hadam himself. So you have a mitzvah to kill himself. What does that even mean? So that's a really great point. So please remind me to look into that. I'd love to explore that further.
I'll send you an email.
Thank you. Shkoyach. Okay, so moving forward, Hakol golen al yedei Yisrael. We said in the Mishnah, anyone who kills a Jewish person goes into galus. So the Gemara says, Hakol golen al yedei Yisrael. Let's see, Evid Vakusi. So who are we talking about in contrast to a standard Jewish person? We are not talking about a non-Jewish person because that's a different case, but we're talking about either an Eved Kanani, a non-Jewish servant. So a non-Jewish male servant is actually in an interesting liminal category where he actually gets a bris milah, he gets a bris. He's not a complete Jew yet, but he's in like this pseudo-Jewish stage where he keeps all non-time-bound mitzvos. The reason he doesn't keep time-bound mitzvos, presumably, is because he has to be at the beck and call of his master. So therefore, he's exempt from those mitzvos. And when he gets freed, should he be freed, That's another halachic discussion. Are you allowed to free your servant? That there might be problems with that halachically. So then you bring him to mikvah and he becomes a full Jewish man at that point. So he's in this pseudo-religious stage. And then we're talking about a kusi. A kusi are people who converted under certain pressures. So there's a machlokus in the Gemara whether their conversion is fully recognized or not. And also, even once they converted, they strayed from the ways of God and from God's laws. So also they're in this kind of Jewish, but not precisely Jewish status. So they're not non-Jewish, but they're not quite bona fide full force Jews either. And that's what puts them in this odd category here. So we say, Tanina l'hadatan rabbanan, we taught a brisa that teaches the same principles as our Mishnah. Eved v'kusi go lev Israel. A servant and a kusi go into exile and also can receive lashes based on their interaction with a Jewish person. V'Yisrael go lev kusi ve'eved. And a Jewish person could incur Malchus, can incur lashes and incur exile through harming a kusi or eved. So I guess some level of equity right there, if that's what you're looking for. So bishlama eved kusi galed Israel, it's understandable. I can think of two scenarios where an eved and kusi go either to exile or get lashes from harming a Jewish person. What would the cases be? Also, veloka, sorry, Israel, veloka, gola dekatle, veloka delatye. So what are the cases? The cases are where he curses somebody. So the two cases are as follows. You go to exile if you accidentally kill the Jew, and you get malchus if you curse the Jew. There is an issa d'oraisa, there is a prohibition for one Jew to curse another Jew. And should you curse another Jew, you receive lashes. So that makes sense. If a kusi or eved curses a Jew, they get lashes. If they kill a Jew inadvertently, they go into exile. El Yisrael gola veloka aide kusi bishlama gola dekatle el loka amai the amai delatye v'nasiv amechlo sar both. So both amai say amecha. So the question that comes up here is, it's conceivable, it makes sense. I can have a case where an eved and kusi go into exile. A Jew goes into exile for killing the kusi and for killing an eved inadvertently, but he doesn't make sense that a Jewish person would also get malchus, get lashes for cursing at least a kusi, because it says v'nasiv amechlo saor. So it says in your nation, but it's only prohibited midoraisa to curse someone who participates and adheres to the laws of the Jewish nation, the halacha. But since the kusim have strayed from the ways of God, they strayed from Jewish law, so there's no prohibition to curse them to the extent that you would receive lashes, you receive malchus as a result. So the question is, how then can the brisa tell us that a Jewish person could get malchus via harming an eved or a kusi? That's the question. And here's the answer. Ella Amar Avacha bar Yaakov, maybe he suggests, could go sheheid bo fuhuzam, where maybe it's a case where a Jewish person testified, and then an eved or kusi came in and turned him and his fellow witness into Adam Zoman, right? Remember, we learned about Adam Zoman a long time ago? We're bringing it back in, but only a brief moment, just because we miss it so much. Maybe the case where a Jew could get malchus from a kusi or eved is where a kusi or eved testified against the Jewish person and turned him into Adam Zoman. The issue is, the kavase gabe eved, you have to say the same thing for an eved. Shehebo, v'huzam, eved bar edasu. Is it eved bar edus? Can an eved testify in court? An eved, a servant, is not able to testify in court. He's pasal le'edus. So that's not a conceivable answer, because a kusi can testify against a Jew in court, but an eved cannot. Since a servant cannot, that's not a viable answer. So what are we dealing with? Where either the Jew struck a kusi or eved, or the eved or kusi struck a Yisrael, struck the Jew, but he pricked him to the extent that you couldn't assess it. It doesn't have the worth. You wouldn't even have to compensate him a small amount of a pruta. We do not compare this to curses, which there is an exclusion, but rather in a case where a Jew causes a small form of damage, harms a kusi or non-Jew, a kusi or servant, and a servant or kusi harms a Jew, either way, they would get malchus, they would get lashes. Now, why is that true? Because when someone harms another person, they violate the prohibition of Torah, Rashi says, of lo sosif pen yosef. And usually one doesn't get lashes because you provide monetary compensation. Remember, we learned about Gedei Rishaso, you only get one punishment. So in a case where you compensate someone for their loss, you don't get lashes. But where you cause him not enough damage that you wouldn't have to compensate him, then you get malchus. Which actually, you're going to say, wait a minute, like I may as well just damage him more already. That way I don't get malchus. I think there actually was a case in the Gemara of somebody like that. Hanan Bisha, was that his name? I think it came up above a comma, possibly. That would make sense. So, but the thing is, remember how in Parshas Noach, remember we're told what's the reason that the Dor Hamabel, the generation of the flood, had to be destroyed? Because of sexual morality and because of theft. Now, what kind of theft were they doing? They did theft that was pachos mishava pruta. Each and every time they stole, they would steal such a negligible amount that, like, I wouldn't even bother bring you to court for it. It's just so small, it's not worth the bother of going to even a small claims court. Or I couldn't even hold you accountable because it's not even a measurable amount. And they take little by little by little. And so that, in a certain degree, is even more conniving. And the Torah wants to make sure that you don't try any loopholes around theft, thinking that if you steal less, you won't be held accountable, that it wallops you with malchus if you try playing that game. So that maybe that's the moral idea behind it. That's the lesson behind it. So, okay, that brings us to the end of the Gemara that we are learning tonight. What we will do now is I will pause for a moment and just take any questions or thoughts that are remaining. And then I want to get to the ambulance question that we opened up with, which I'm very excited to share. But just before we get to that, anyone have any questions on this Gemara that just clarification if possible? Any clarification questions that I can take? Okay, hopefully, even if we have our questions, it was hopefully clear. Okay. We have 10 minutes this time. Wow, that's a lot of time, more than I usually give us. So the question is, once again, I am driving an ambulance and I have a chula in there. I have someone who's sick. I need to rush them to the hospital. And on my way to the hospital, lo aleinu, God forbid, I'm driving so fast, I didn't see that pedestrian in the middle of the street. He was crossing and I ran him over. So the question is, should I be held accountable for that? Should I be sent to, now definitely I didn't deliberately kill him, but if, during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, where all the Ari Mikla, all the cities of refuge are in place, would that ambulance driver have to go into exile for inadvertently killing that pedestrian? What would we say?
Was the ambulance driver using his siren?
Yeah, we'll presume he was using his siren, but you also have to keep in mind that he's going at such high speeds that, he could just come around the corner any second. But you're saying is that the pedestrian hearing the sirens should have not been crossing the street, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's say the case is he accidentally, while he's making a turn, accidentally pulls a little bit onto the sidewalk and then hits him. What if that's the case? Would that change your opinion?
Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying is that if the pedestrian is doing everything right and he's on the sidewalk, then it's the ambulance driver's fault and he should go to Gullus as a result. Okay. Would anyone argue with that? Would anyone say maybe the ambulance driver should still be let off the hook, even if he inadvertently kills a pedestrian who was following the laws and obeyed avoiding the ambulance to the best of his ability?
The
So is it
argument would
possible
be
he
that
was-
you, oh, go ahead, Phyllis. Go ahead.
Okay. Is it possible that he was in such a hurry to do a mitzvah that that's why it happened? And, he's in the process of doing a mitzvah and something terrible happens. Maybe it's mitigated by the mitzvah that he's so intent on doing.
Right. So, usually like what Phyllis is pointing out is that we would say someone's being a chassid shota. That means a pious fool. That, imagine I'm trying to get to Minyan and I want to make sure I'm there for the first Kaddish. But meanwhile, I knock over 5 people and 10 tables and a pile of svarm on my way there. Then, true, I'm on my way to do a mitzvah, but I shouldn't cause any damage in the process. The thing here is that the ambulance driver not only is permitted to drive above the speed limit, but in theory, he's actually obligated to do so in order to save the life. But it's always a funny thing, right? Because
Yeah.
aren't you endangering lives by doing that at the same time? So that's the issue.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me share with you some of the halakha. Oh, sorry, Toby. We'll take.
Yeah, I was
Toby's
gonna say,
point,
this
then we'll
kind
move
of thing
forward.
comes up, in so many contexts, like with policemen that are in a chase.
Yeah.
To catch somebody to prevent them from committing a crime, or they've already committed the crime, and they get into an accident because they were driving so fast. I mean, this kind of thing happens all the time.
Right. Okay. And so this is Toby's expertise. So
I
it's definitely
I
not
would
just a
say
theoretical.
That the ambulance driver or the police officer, whoever the emergency driver is, still has to act as a reasonable and prudent driver under the
They do.
circumstances.
They do.
Now, the circumstances will justify higher speeds, but that doesn't mean you can be reckless.
Correct.
So we have to assume that is correct. We have to assume he's going at reasonably high speeds, but again, you could still be within reasonably high speeds that the situation demands, but still accidentally, not negotiate a turn properly and hit somebody. That can still happen.
Right.
Oh yeah.
So in the United States, they would be liable civilly, and the insurance would pay, but you wouldn't be liable for criminal charges. That's what the result would be.
Fascinating. So in other words, you be chayev like nezikin for like it's like tort
Correct.
damages,
Damages, yeah.
but not for murder. That's the
Correct.
distinction. Okay, so okay, very good. So let me try to pack in some of the content over here. It looks like the ideas you're suggesting are all excellent points. So this all really comes to an obscure tashbates. The tashbate says that a doctor who heals the exterior of someone's body, he deals with meleches yad. He stitches wounds and deals with more I don't know what the right terminology is, more like the blunt outer areas of the body. So if he inadvertently kills someone in the process, he is liable to exile. But someone who deals with pharmaceuticals, who gives medicine to someone, does not go into exile. And the question on this tashbates is lama lilach, right? Like what Toby's telling us. Lama lilach. So Toby, your question is everyone's question on a tashbate. So you're in good company. That's what Rav Silberstein asked. Why would I distinguish between these two things? So one approach that he suggests on his own is that maybe the tashbates is really just trying to say that in a case where I'm negligent, where I didn't take all avenues within my purview, within my ability, then I'm held responsible. And that's an example of a case where someone might be less responsible in the former, and where for pharmacy, you did all the calculations, you took the BMI into account, you took his previous medical history into account. At that point, you can't accidentally slip up while stitching. You just gave him the potion and, based on what the science tells you, and you hope it works, and then a fluke accident happens. That's one approach. The other approach that is given from the Minchas Yitzchak is actually, it's pretty compelling. The first case is when you kill someone directly, biyadayim, because you're stitching the guy and then you I don't know, you impale him somehow and kill him while you're doing it. That's not such a good case. You're doing surgery. But in a case of pharmaceuticals, you didn't actually kill him b'yadayim. It's a grumma. You gave him the medicine, and then he did the ma'aseh hariga. He drank it. Now, perhaps there may have been malpractice. You may have misled him, but that's not considered, I guess, what you might call first-degree murder. I don't know how you say it in American law. But you didn't directly, it's not like you stabbed him in the heart. Rather, you gave him something that then he killed himself by taking. You're still responsible, but it's an indirect action as opposed to a direct action. That's all to say, an ambulance driver who directly kills the person on his way to the hospital, that's a direct action. He rammed somebody. That would seemingly not qualify for a dispensation that some doctors have. So that would be the first side. That would be the school of thought that the ambulance driver has to go to exile.
But there's a difference. There's a difference because with the ambulance driver, the person he hurts or kills is not the person he was trying to help.
Excellent.
So it's one step removed.
Excellent. So our Silverstein literally brings up that next point, Toby. Yasher koach. Right ahead of us, right into our next point. So he quotes the Yad Avram. In the Yad Avraham, he talks about basically our case. And he brings up your point as well, that in the case of our Mishnah, remember in our Mishnah from last week, we learned that a shliach beis din or a father or a teacher who accidentally kills the child, well, who is he doing the mitzvah to? The child. And he inadvertently killed him and did the aveira, the sin to him as well. But here, as Toby rightly points out, the mitzvah is saving Ruvain, who's in the ambulance, and the aveira, the sin, was committed to Shimon, who was killed by the ambulance. So is that still qualify for the exemption of being involved in a Dvar mitzvah, thus exempting me from going into exile? So he actually says that distinction is a red herring. It doesn't matter. And actually, it doesn't matter. We don't distinguish in that case. Why? Because remember we had a Havamina last time that chopping wood for the sukkah, remember we said chopping wood for the sukkah is not a mitzvah. But the Havamina, the assumption of Gemara was that if chopping wood for a sukkah was indeed a mitzvah, and I accidentally killed someone in the process, I would be exempt from going to exile. So actually, we see clearly from the Gemara, not so clear, but I think clearly enough from the Gemara, that I can be chopping wood for a sukkah, which is a completely separate deed. But if I inadvertently kill someone while doing that, they're not connected to one another. I wasn't helping the other lumberjack in the forest, but I would be exempted nonetheless if I'm involved in a mitzvah. So that doesn't actually, I know intuitively, Toby, makes sense. That should be connected. But we see from the Gemara that's not the case. Mm-hmm. And then the other point that someone might ask is, wait a minute, he's not really helping the patient right now. He's just driving him to the hospital. But the ambulance driver is not really applying any medicine. So could we really say he's involved in a dvar mitzvah? He's involved in a mitzvah activity right now? Well, the answer is yes as well. He quotes the Birchei Yosef, who says that there is an opinion out there that a Kohen, so Kohanim are not allowed to go into cemeteries, they're not allowed to become tamei meis, not allowed to become impure by contact with a dead body, but a Kohen who needs to return a lost object to somebody, and the only way to get to that person to do Hashavas Aveda and return that lost object is by going through a cemetery, he'd be allowed to do it. But the question is, wait a minute, why is he allowed to go through the cemetery? Even if you say, right, Hashavas Aveda is a mitzvah, so it should supersede becoming Tameh, he's not performing the mitzvah of returning lost object while he's walking through the cemetery, is he? Well, yes, he is. It's considered a continuous mitzvah. Even while he's traveling to get that lost item back to its original owner, that's considered a mitzvah. Therefore, one can suggest that the ambulance, while it's traveling to the hospital, even though the ambulance driver is not doing anything to help the patient right now, he's not healing him, he's not applying any medicine, he's not doing surgery on him, he's only bringing him there. You might think it's a hechsher mitzvah, but actually it's considered the mitzvah itself. And therefore, there is an opinion, one could say, that the ambulance driver would not be liable to go into exile And so those are the different shikulim. Those are different considerations to take into account. And it's beautiful. Obviously, God forbid it should ever happen to anyone we ever know. But just from a complete, again, an abstract standpoint, it's a very fascinating discussion. But God willing, it should always remain abstract for us. Okay, Yasher Koach, everyone. I will stay on for a few more minutes, but it's already 9:01. So anyone who needs to log off, I wish you a good Shabbos. Excellent learning together.
Thank
as always.
you. Thank you. Very good class. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, any remaining questions?
I have a comment.
I had another opinion.
Okay, I'll
but
try to take them
another
briefly. I have a call to jump on at
I have a
9:05, so let's
Now-
just go one at a time.
Look, it's just also common sense. If you hear a siren, you're driving, you pull aside. If you're walking on a pavement and you hear a siren, don't go in the middle of the street. Stay back until the ambulance, the police car is past you. Just common sense. I
Right.
had a situation when I lived in Queens. There was something that occurred and I saw a policeman running with a gun. I went into a store. I didn't want to know where he went and I didn't want to be a casualty if he used his gun. It's also
Yeah.
a lot of common sense.
Right. So what Ruth is pointing out is that it's common sense that if you hear sirens, steer clear, like Ruth said.
Very
And
good.
that's
Very
why I
good.
wanted, and my grandfather brought up a similar point, and that's why I think I needed to adjust the case, because you're both right. If he's in the middle of the street, what's he doing in the middle of the street while an ambulance is coming by? So
Yeah, well-
rather, the case I think is where he's on the sidewalk, the ambulance, while turning, accidentally jumps the curb. That's what we have to assume. So good point. Zadie, you had a point there as well.
Yeah, I have a couple.
Have a good
Thank
job.
you, Ruth.
Okay, first of all, when you're driving, you hear a siren. You don't necessarily know whether it's on your street, it's on another street, which direction they're going in. You, you don't know whether you should take evasive action. Sometimes even if you should, what evasive action you should take, because you don't know what that ambulance or police car, fire engine, whatever, is going to do. It creates an ambiguous situation
Right.
sometimes.
I remember, when I first started driving, and even while I still drive right now, and it's been a good number of years since I got my license, I always have that anxiety. I'm like, I hear sirens, like, where do I go? Where do I go? And then, inadvertently, I might actually wind up in his way. So
And
that's,
Rabbi, what if the person is deaf?
Right. What if that person is deaf? Well, are there any what kind of
Have to wear
accommodations
the
are made
hearing
for people
aids.
to drive if they're deaf?
I don't think deaf people should drive.
Okay.
That would be, I think, a negligence in itself.
Ah,
You need to have the auditory signals.
No, I
And
meant
there's
the guy
another thing that bothers me
the
is,
guy crossing the street is deaf.
oh,
He doesn't hear the ambulance, the siren.
that is a problem. But another thing that I wanted to cover is that, and it bothers me, is that police officers, when they're in a hot pursuit, just feel that they have to carry it to the very end to apprehend the perpetrator that is fleeing from them. And there have been instances where people are driving in and out of traffic in the wrong direction to escape a police officer. Somebody is likely to get killed, and police officers ought to drop the pursuit under those circumstances, because they're going to get some innocent person killed.
interesting. Well, they're okay. So that's a little bit beyond my area of expertise. I haven't thought about that, but Zadie, thank you for bringing that case to our attention. It's more food for thought. Okay, I have a call to jump onto, but it's always a pleasure learning. Thank you for your continued commitment.
Thank you so
And,
much. Good Shabbos.
And I'm wishing you all a good Shabbos and looking forward to next week, God willing.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.